Hello, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome back to Balliol. We're delighted to have you with us this afternoon, and I hope you're going to have a wonderful time enjoying the afternoon's activities and, of course, the dinner this evening. It's my enormous pleasure now to introduce you to Dr. Dan Butt, a fellow and tutor in politics at Balliol, who is going to deliver the Balliol Society Weekend lecture on Reparations and Historic Injustice. Thank you, Dan.
I want to talk today about reparations for historic injustice, about what duties or obligations people living in the present have as a result of wrongdoing that happened in the past, and also about what should happen in policy terms in response to these duties. This is a topical subject. It's a subject of a great deal of contemporary debate, certainly and notoriously within universities like Oxford, but more broadly as well, as colonial powers such as the United Kingdom reflect on their past and face claims for reparation from their former colonies. And these are the kind of cases I'm going to focus on today. International cases, where we're thinking about what people living in one community owe to another, and in particular, claims stemming from past colonial relations, characterized by domination, exploitation, and cultural imposition. Now, this is a hot topic now, but this hasn't always been the case. For a long time in the years following the Second World War, the vast majority of popular interest in reparations claims either related to the aftermath of World War II, and what was owed in particular by Axis powers, especially Germany and Japan, or to what we might call domestic reparation cases, where a group of citizens of one country were claiming reparations from their own government. So, for example, notable claims for reparations from the US government came from indigenous peoples in the United States, from Japanese Americans interned during the Second World War, and from African Americans descended from slaves but who were living in the United States. Much less attention was paid to the idea that reparations might be owed to the descendants of slaves living in the Caribbean, or to countries in Africa that were targeted in the Atlantic slave trade. So just one illustration of this. In 2000, Elazar Barkan published a groundbreaking book on reparations. Here it is, The Guilt of Nations, Restitution and Negotiating Historic Injustices. Now, half of this book is about World War II claims, and the other half consists of 6 chapters which are collectively titled Colonialism and Its Aftermath. But strikingly, of these 6 chapters, 5 are actually about domestic claims advanced by indigenous peoples around the world against their own governments. Only the final chapter considers international cases. Tellingly, perhaps, that's titled Restitution for Slavery, Opportunity or Fantasy? But things have shifted quickly in terms of popular interest and discussion, if not necessarily in terms of policy outcomes. And if you'll forgive a personal anecdote at the start, in 2019, I agreed to act as an expert witness in a case at the High Court. Lambeth Council and the Metropolitan Police were being sued in relation to an event in 2017 called the Africa International Day of Action, co-organised by the Rastafarian Movement UK and the Nation of Islam. Now, this was to have included a pre-recorded broadcast from Louis Farrakhan, the leader of the Nation of Islam, who's banned from entering the UK, on the subject, reparations. What does the UK and Europe owe us? Now, essentially, the event wasn't allowed to go ahead, and the claimants to the suit argued that this infringed various provisions of the Human Rights Act relating to freedom of speech and assembly. I was asked to write a report for the court on the following question: whether and to what extent reparations, including the historical and ongoing effects of the transatlantic slave trade, is an important topic for current political and social discourse and campaigning. Now, I wrote the report in 2020. The case was due to come to the High Court in May 2021, but Lambeth Council and the Met accepted liability just beforehand and paid £92,000 in damages. So the event was 2017, the case ended in 2021, but what was striking was that what seemed relatively disputable in 2017, are reparations for the slave trade an important contemporary topic, seemed undeniable by 2021. In writing the report, I found long-standing campaigns by particular individuals and groups in Africa, in the Caribbean, and in countries like the US and the UK. People may remember, for example, the late Labour MP Bernie Grant long campaigned on the issue here, and periodic bursts of popular interest, but then a clear step change in the last few years as the issue moved to the centre of the political agenda. And so actually, by the end, there was a sense that my report was pretty pointless. The issue was obviously controversial. In fact, the extent of the controversy made the claim that reparations were an important topic of contemporary debate trivially true. So my topic today is contemporary reparative claims stemming from colonialism. In particular, I want to think about what should happen when it seems that contemporary debts stemming from past injustice are massive in scale, and so seemingly call for some kind of non-ideal resolution or settlement. So what happens when the debt is so great that it looks like it can't be paid? What I'll go on to do later is to differentiate between two different approaches to settling claims for reparation, which I call bad faith and good faith settlement. What I'm not going to do, and you may think this is a slightly controversial tactic, is to spend a huge amount of time trying to establish the claim that former colonial powers do in fact have significant debts to their former colonies. Now, I accept, of course, that this is a much disputed question, and I've spent much of the last 20 years talking about this question, as have many other political theorists and activists, and indeed, I will take this opportunity of mentioning that I wrote a book about this very question. Oh, good heavens, here it is. How did I get there? Rectifying International Injustice. So, in this book, on the table, I argue that there are three ways in which present-day persons can be connected to historic injustice in a morally relevant way. First, when they've benefited from, and others still suffer the effects of, historic injustice. Second, when they're in possession of, broadly speaking, stolen property to which others have inherited entitlements. And thirdly, when present-day people are members of historically continuous communities which bear ongoing responsibility for failing to fulfill reparative duties to others. Now, this isn't an exhaustive set. Other writers have put forward accounts that rest on whether people have active association with the actions of their ancestors, or the value of transgenerational contracts and treaties, or more simply, sometimes they just assert that it's reasonable to hold present-day communities responsible for the costs of the actions of their historic forebears. Now, of course, all are controversial, and arguments in favour of contemporary reparative obligations will have to contend with, for example, sceptical arguments that claim that the passage of time lessens or eliminates the need to rectify past wrongdoing. But it is striking, I think, that much existing work in favour of reparations has sought to pick out a single form of morally relevant connection, such as benefiting from injustice or inheriting stolen property, and sought to build a case for reparations on this single principle. I think doing this, and I'm guilty of doing this myself, but I think doing this misses something important out. Now, you can see why people might want to argue in this kind of way. Perhaps if you want to build a case for a specific reparative policy in a particular context. So, for example, if you want to argue about the restitution of cultural property like the Parthenon marbles, you might just argue about inheriting stolen property rather than anything else. Some of it, alas, might be to do with the nature of academic publishing. Before you set up your own argument, you have to knock down everyone else's argument, or so it's often believed. But I think this way of arguing also has the effect of minimizing the overall extent of the reparative debt which is possessed by contemporary agents, particularly states, which are characterized by some kind of ongoing, albeit messy and perhaps interrupted, existence through time. It means that the opponents of reparation policies are able to focus on the particular weaknesses of specific accounts, pointing to periods of time, for example, when a given principle doesn't seem to be in play, if there are gaps in the continuous identity of states, for example, or if chains of inheritance are broken, or maintaining that particular models can't be extended to all areas of contemporary reparative politics. Can, for example, the inheritance model do anything about the non-material dimensions of historic injustice? Can claims about innocently benefiting from injustice in the present day say anything useful about political apologies for past wrongdoing? So what I want to ask is, what if, instead of seeing such principles as in competition with one another, we saw them as largely complementary and as potentially having force in different circumstances, sometimes collectively, sometimes individually, sometimes in concert with one another? This would mean that a full account of what's owed would have to include all morally relevant linkages between past and present in play. It would need to take account of the way that reparative duties of benefit and entitlement, which can be acquired quite innocently in the first instance, can give rise to further duties of reparation when they go unfulfilled, meaning that the agents in question are now themselves wrongdoers. The thought here is that failing to fulfill a reparative obligation is not a one-off action, but an ongoing process. Each day that the obligation is not fulfilled is a day when something that should have been done is not done. So an acceptance of the existence of present-day state-level reparative obligations typically commits one to a particular view of the modern-day states in question as repeat offenders, wrongdoers whose unjust actions stretch back in time, often to the commission of the original acts of injustice itself. Now, in many cases, the narrative told will be a relatively uncomplicated one of continuous malfeasance, which originates in historic wrongdoing that straightforwardly was not rectified at the time. So from this perspective, if we look at history during and since the colonial period, the story is one of sustained and repeated wrongdoing. Multiple grave wrongs were perpetrated, often over prolonged periods of time, with no subsequent attempt to apologize or to compensate the victim. We might think, for example, of Britain's involvement in the slave trade, which came to a formal end not with the payment of compensation to those enslaved and their families and communities, but to the slave owners who lost out financially as a result of the emancipation of their purported property. We might think of the British experience of decolonization, whereby independence for territories such as Kenya was only granted on the condition of agreement that liability for the wrongs of the colonial period were the responsibility of the new successor governments rather than the British state. Consider the post-independence relationship of Haiti and France, whereby Haiti was compelled to pay devastating levels of compensation to France between 1825 and 1947 to compensate France for its losses following Haiti's successful slave revolt, and where the payment of the compensation could only be funded by borrowing further money from French banks at extortionate rates. The list goes on and on. Now, I think it's helpful at this point to consider two examples of modern-day reparative claims to appreciate the potential scale of contemporary reparative liabilities. So first, let's think about claims for reparation for slavery within the United States. There are various ways to quantify what would be owed if the US government were to seek to pay reparations in the present day. Now, some attempts take a minimalist approach, focusing just on a subset of claims which, one might think, could be articulated without the need for contentious, sort of complicated counterfactual reasoning, by maintaining that specific property entitlements emanating from slavery could have been inherited by the descendants of slaves. So this is the stolen property account I talked about before. So you just think about payment to slaves that should have happened historically and didn't take place. So, for example, one recent study by Thomas Kramer estimates the present value of US slave labor for the 89 years from the country's founding until the end of the Civil War. Now, he gives an estimate. Obviously, there's a wide range here, but he gives an estimate in 2009 dollars ranging from $5.9 to $14.2 trillion. That is a lot of money. It's not clear it's an impossible sum for the US government to pay, especially if structured over multiple years, and given that it might be seen as a form of internal investment within the United States. For comparison, Joe Biden's recently proposed budget involved initial annual spending of $6 trillion, rising to $8.2 trillion by 2031. But it must be stressed that this sum relates only to 89 years of wages. There's nothing in such a figure relating to compensation for enslavement, for physical and mental abuse, for all the myriad wrongs that accompanied slavery. Nor is there consideration of the wrong of not paying reparations up to now, as distinct from the accumulation of interest in the money that's not been paid. If we tweak the formula to include such considerations, we quickly arrive at eye-watering sums. In his 1973 book, The Case for Black Reparations, Boris Bitker considered how one might go about constructing a more complete bill to take account of other forms of historic racial injustice. He writes, "For want of a better measure of these imponderables, we might speculate about the outcome of a lawsuit for damages brought by a white pupil who was erroneously assigned to a Jim Crow school for a school year before Brown versus Board of Education was decided. I venture to guess," he says, "that a Southern jury would be more likely to award damages of $25,000 rather than $1,000. Without wishing to overemphasize it," he says, "I offer as a bit of relevant evidence a jury award of $875 in 1913 for a white railroad passenger for being compelled to ride for 3 miles in a Jim Crow car." Now, if we calculate the reparative debt by plugging in these kinds of figures and holding that equivalent sums over the lifetimes of those wronged should be paid to descendants with interest, we would be looking at a bill of a quite extraordinary size. My second case concerns Greece and Germany. At the peak of the Greek debt crisis in 2015, much play was made of the claim that there was something odd about thinking that Greece was in a historical debt to Germany, given the nature of their relations during the Second World War. The Tsipras government spoke explicitly of bringing reparations into the reckoning of the terms for the Greek financial bailout, and the following specific claims, along with others, were invoked. Tens, possibly hundreds of billions of euros in present-day money as compensation for destroyed infrastructure and goods, including archaeological treasures looted by the Nazis from 1941 to 1944. Compensation for the estimated 300,000 people who died from famine during the winter of 1941-2. Compensation for the slaughter of civilians as reprisals for partisan attacks. Repayment of some 1.9 billion drachmas, around 50 million euros today, that the Jewish community paid as ransom to occupying authorities in 1942, in return for 10,000 Jewish men being held as slave labourers. The men were released, only to be sent to concentration camps the following year. Repayment of an interest-free loan of 568 million Reichsmark, 7.1 billion euros, that the Nazis forced Greece to make to Germany in 1942, and returning the train fares that the Reichsbahn received for transporting Jews to their deaths. Now, the range of different claims here is striking. Some refer to terrible wrongs, death from famine, the slaughter of civilians, for which there can evidently be no adequate compensatory response. Others are tangible, specific, even tragically mundane, claims relating to specific sums of money misappropriated in very particular circumstances, such as train fares forcibly levied to take Jews to their deaths. The point is how very quickly the bill adds up, even when we're only talking about the material aspects of historic wrongdoing. Even if this was the only basis for present-day reparative obligations, the liability for colonial powers such as the UK would be massive. The scale of British colonialism was breathtaking. In Africa, Asia, and beyond, the sun never set, after all, on the British Empire. But of course, one can still say much more. To characterize the injustice of colonialism in material terms is to miss the point of the particular kind of grievous wrongdoing which it entailed. If one expands the scope of reparative justice to maintain, as some do, that claims to compensation for this wrongdoing can be inherited by the descendants of victims, then the liability of present-day states, such as the UK, looks to be gigantic. Okay, so I've argued that historic colonial wrongdoing and subsequent failures to effect redress have given rise to potentially gigantic contemporary reparative obligations. How should those possessing such obligations respond to a bill of such a scale? There seem to be three options. First, one might do nothing and use the scale of the debt as a pretext for avoiding any kind of reparative obligation whatsoever. This seems straightforwardly unacceptable from a moral point of view. And an inability to pay a debt doesn't mean the debt disappears, it just means that it can't be paid in full. At the very least, one ought to pay as much as one can. Second, one might attempt to pay in full. There are both hard and soft limits to such a strategy. In some cases, the amount that's owed may straightforwardly be greater than the sum of resources at the disposal of the agent with the reparative duty, and indeed may be greater than they can expect to access in the foreseeable future. But even if we're not dealing with sums of quite this scale, there will likely still be extreme reluctance to pay gigantic amounts, given the predictable impact that doing so will have on the flourishing and the life projects of those who must pay. So the third alternative is to look to make some kind of settlement. This is perhaps the solution that many people are naturally inclined to support, but I want to suggest today it's fraught with moral danger. Settlements for serious injustice will typically mean victims getting less than they should under a fully just compensation scheme. This means that unilateral redress, where the side with the obligations simply decides what they want to pay, is generally not possible. If a settlement is to constitute a morally acceptable response to the demands of corrective justice, then the party who is to get less than they should will need voluntarily to agree to the terms of the settlement in question. What is needed, and the irony of this is extraordinary given how the history of colonialism has in fact unfolded, is a form of debt forgiveness, not of, but by formerly colonized peoples. Now, I think it's helpful here to do a little bit more to unpack the idea of settlement. In his study of the concept, the philosopher Robert Goodin identifies a range of different usages of the term, which he labels modes of settling. Specifically, he talks about settling down in a situational place, settling in, as in accommodating ourselves to our circumstances and our place, settling up with people we've displaced, unsettled, or otherwise wronged in the process, settling for, learning to make do in our newly settled circumstances, and settling on a belief or value, project or commitment, way of being or way of living. He suggests that these different conceptions all share something in common, specifically that in settling we look for some kind of fixity. Now, the search for fixity has certainly been a feature of various forms of past wrongdoing and forms of colonial settlement, corresponding to settling down and settling in Goodin's schema, are good examples of forms of historic injustice that call out for contemporary redress. But most relevant to our current purposes are the ideas of settling up and settling for. The first relates to the ideal of reparative justice, settling up, whereby the moral balance between perpetrator and victim is restored, with the perpetrator doing whatever is necessary to repair the moral breach. The latter, settling for, however, relates to a non-ideal outcome, where the victim cannot get their due, but must settle for something less instead in order to achieve the kind of fixity that Goodin describes. The moral danger in settlement, I want to suggest, lies in the further injustice suffered by victims in this second scenario. So, I've suggested that there are good reasons to believe that the legacy of colonialism gives rise to gigantic contemporary reparative obligations. So suppose that citizens of Western states, such as the UK, accept this belief, that they must try their best to settle this debt, but argue that they won't be able to meet their obligations in full. Now, the desire on the part of perpetrators to come to a form of settlement in such cases isn't, I don't think, necessarily wrong. One may believe in good faith that the moral value of paying the full price is trumped by forward-looking considerations, and may understand a settlement in such a case in terms of balancing forward and backward-looking interests and obligations in the name of fairness. So you might have good reasons to think that you should try to resist claims to pay literally everything you should. But this could still be very demanding, depending on one's account of how to balance backward and forward-looking considerations. For example, if one were to argue that citizens of such states with reparative duties should settle at the level where any further payment would reduce them below some minimal level of well-being, that seems very demanding. However, this is not the more familiar understanding of settlement that we use in popular discourse, especially in legal contexts. In cases of what I term bad faith settlement, the perpetrator is simply unwilling to pay out on the scale in question and cannot be made to do so, but is prepared to settle for a smaller sum to close the issue. Now, this kind of settlement is grounded not in morality, but in self-interest. It's in the offender's interest to be able to draw a line under the events in question, and so they bargain and compromise to pay as little as possible while achieving their goal of a resolution to a given dispute. Now, this kind of approach seems clearly unacceptable in relation to the reparation of historic injustice, although, as we'll see, it's commonly found in real-world cases. Even if the bad faith settlement is the result of some kind of agreement with the wronged group, the mere fact of agreement doesn't mean that justice has been done if the group in question have only agreed to the settlement because the offending group is unwilling to pay any more. A settlement of this form is not only an inadequate response to injustice, it's a fresh act of injustice against the victims in itself. So, if this is bad faith settlement, what is good faith settlement? Well, that's a question I think that can only be answered in outline, outside of the settlement process itself. Good faith settlement accepts the inadequacy of the compensatory response. You can only do so much with compensation. It doesn't claim to make up for that which cannot be repaired, but acknowledges that it's partial, incomplete, and in many ways unsatisfactory. It may include, but is not limited to, material compensation or restitution, and will typically also include elements of apology, commemoration, and education. But it doesn't use commitments in those fields to evade more costly commitments elsewhere. It ties backward-looking accounts of reparation to forward-looking concerns of reconciliation. Good faith settlement can and should be linked to questions of structural change and institutional reform. It can and should be linked to deliberative processes and truth and reconciliation movements. Good faith settlement, I think, engages in open-ended fashion without pre-commitments or limitations. It's emphatically not a negotiation. It seeks to involve all relevant agents and keeps the question of who has standing in deliberation open, paying particular concern to persons within groups who've historically been oppressed and disadvantaged. It acknowledges the need to equalize power relations and develop new forms of relationships. Rather than drawing a line and forgetting about the past, it acknowledges the significance of history by committing to a new kind of relationship. In international terms, we might envisage that good faith settlement might involve the reform of international and regional governance structures, a reworking of the structure of the United Nations, debt repudiation, and very substantial commitments to development, regeneration, and climate justice. Its particular terms would, of course, though, be determined by its participants. Now, bad faith settlement, by contrast, generally doesn't do any of this. Yet this is the dominant form in many real-world cases of purported settlement. And so I want to consider three cases today. So the first relates to the British government's decision in 2013 to pay £19.9 million in compensation and costs to more than 5,000 elderly Kenyans who suffered torture and abuse during the Mau Mau uprising in the 1950s. Foreign Secretary William Hague, at the time, told the House of Commons that the payment was being made in, quote, full and final settlement of a High Court action brought by 5 victims who suffered under the British colonial administration. Hague said, and I quote, "The British government recognises that Kenyans were subjected to torture and other forms of ill treatment at the hands of the colonial administration. The British government sincerely regrets that these abuses took place and that they marred Kenya's progress to independence. Torture and ill treatment are abhorrent violations of human dignity, which we unreservedly condemn." So Britain also agreed to support the construction of a memorial to the victims of colonial torture and abuse in Nairobi, but stressed that the government continued to deny liability for the actions of the colonial administration and indicated it would defend claims brought from other former British colonies, saying, "We do not believe that this settlement establishes a precedent in relation to any other British colonial administration." Now, it should be noted, I think, that the UK initially opposed this legal action, accepting that the claimants were indeed subject to torture by the British colonial administration, but maintaining that there was no persisting liability owing to, first, an argument relating to the expiration of a statute of limitations, and second, the claim that responsibility for British colonial atrocities had passed from the British to the Kenyan government at the point of decolonisation. The settlement came only when it became clear that the government might lose the case. Following the decision, Kenyan groups announced plans for further legal cases for compensation for a further 40,000 Kenyans, a move opposed by the UK government. And the first test case in this litigation was dismissed in 2018, with the judge ruling that the passage of some 50 years had compromised the defendant's ability to defend the claim. The second case concerns women forced into sexual enslavement during the Second World War by the Japanese Imperial Army. A deal was reached in 2015 between Japan and South Korea, whereby Japan agreed to apologize, accept responsibility, and pay 1 billion yen to fund victims. Both sides, quote, agreed to refrain from criticizing each other on this issue in the international community. South Korea agreed to consider the matter resolved, quote, finally and irreversibly if Japan fulfilled its promises, and South Korea agreed to investigate removing a statue symbolizing victims, which activists had erected in Seoul in 2011. Now, this statue is the image that you have on your handouts today. It's called the Statue of Peace. It's a statue of a young girl to commemorate the plight of victims of sexual enslavement. It's worth stressing that not just the design, but the location of the statue is significant here. You can see from the second image on the handout, which is taken from behind the statue, that the statue is looking directly at the building opposite. That building is the Japanese embassy in Seoul. So the agreement came after many years of inaction, obfuscation, and denial by the Japanese government, and similar inaction during some periods by the South Korean government. A number of surviving victims, only 46 by 2015, had both survived and identified themselves. We don't know who the vast majority of the victims were. Objected to the terms of the deal, claiming they had had no role in the agreement. South Korean Vice Foreign Minister Lim Sung-nam was confronted by one such survivor, 88-year-old Yi Yong-soo, at a meeting in Seoul. "Which country do you belong to?" she shouted at him. "You could at least have let us know what kind of deal you were striking with Japan. Why are you trying to kill us twice?" Now, the South Korean government announced it had cancelled the agreement in 2018 and has since tried to reopen the issue with Japan. The statue is still there. Most recently, a legal claim brought by 12 survivors against the Japanese government was upheld by the Seoul District Court in 2021, which ordered Japan's government to pay reparations of 100 million won each to the families of the 12 women. That's $91,000. Japan has refused to accept the legitimacy of this ruling, with the then Prime Minister Suga claiming, quote, "The issue of comfort women," this term, "between Japan and the Republic of Korea is already settled completely and finally." Now, it should be clear, given the account I've given you, just how far these cases fall short of what I see as the ideal of good faith settlement. Self-interested settlement under duress in the face of the threat of legal action or other forms of external pressure, which seeks to keep payments to a minimum while foreclosing the possibility of further actions by others, is on this account straightforwardly an inadequate response to past wrongdoing. The sums, I think, seem inadequate from the perspective of compensatory justice, and critically, key groups of victims have rejected the purported finality of the processes in question. I'm not going to labour the point. These are, in my view, textbook examples of bad faith settlement. So arguably a more interesting example, I think, is provided by the recent announcement by the German government that following 6 years of negotiations, it's agreed to pay 1.1 billion euros to Namibia as a response to colonial atrocities by the German army in the early 20th century, when, quote, "tens of thousands of men, women and children were shot, tortured or driven into the Kalahari Desert to starve by German troops between 1904 and 1908, after the Herero and Nama tribes rebelled against colonial rule in what was then named German Southwest Africa and is now Namibia." Now, one can certainly point to features of the agreement that seem to reflect features of good faith settlement. In accepting that the events in question should be labelled as genocide, the German foreign minister stated that, quote, "Our aim was and is to find a joint path to genuine reconciliation in remembrance of the victims. That includes our naming the events of the German colonial era in today's Namibia, and particularly the atrocities between 1904 and 1908, unsparingly and without euphemisms, so they accept the language of genocide. However, strikingly, this linguistic accommodation does not extend to the language of reparations itself. The agreement document avoids use of either the term reparations or compensation, and a previous internal progress report on the negotiations, circulated to German parliamentarians the week before the announcement, denied that the payments should be seen in such terms, claiming reparations or individual compensations are not subject to the negotiations. After 100 years, they would be unprecedented. The definition of injustice set up by the 1948 Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of Genocide does not apply retrospectively and cannot be the basis for financial claims. Now, the announcement of the agreement has had a mixed response in Namibia itself. While a spokesman for the Namibian president described the acknowledgement of genocide as the first step in the right direction and claimed that it is the basis for the second step, which is an apology to be followed by reparations, Vice President Nangolo Mbuma noted that the harm caused was in a sense non-compensable and that the amount proposed was insufficient to amount to an adequate settlement, saying, "No amount of money in any currency can truly compensate the life of a human being. We need to recognise that the amount of 1.1 billion euros agreed upon between the two governments is not enough and does not adequately address the initial quantum of reparations initially submitted to the German government." The agreement has been explicitly rejected by groups representing the descendants of the victims, drawn from the minority Herero and Nama peoples, as opposed to the Ovambo majority group that dominates the Namibian government. In the Namibian parliament, opposition politicians condemned the agreement and argued that key affected groups had not been properly involved in deliberations. One opposition legislator spoke of a substandard agreement, stating they have excluded communities, groups of Namibians. That is apartheid the government has practiced. Another told the Namibian Prime Minister, "You have betrayed us," arguing, "You have not allowed for equal participation based on human rights policies. You have not given us the chance to narrate the economic trauma caused by the genocide." Now, the German announcement is certainly striking in that it represents reparations on a different order of magnitude than has hitherto been made in relation to European colonialism, leaving aside, again, of course, the compensation payment made to slave owners by the Slave Compensation Act of 1837. But it should be clear that, if only on account of the reaction of relevant parties withstanding, it can't be seen as an example, in my terms, of good faith settlement. Now, this observation does underline how demanding the account of good faith settlement is. I've argued that the scale of colonial wrongdoing means that not only the participation, which was in fact seemingly lacking in the Namibian case, but also the agreement of victims is necessary to the achievement of a just resolution. Otherwise, an unfulfilled reparative obligation persists. Now, perhaps this conclusion should be understood relative to some type of provisos. We need a full account of what it means to be a party withstanding. There may not need to be a requirement for strict unanimity, so long as all relevant groups are in uncoerced overall agreement. And we might specify that not only perpetrators but also victims need to be operating in some fashion in good faith. Nonetheless, it follows on my account that the good faith agreement of all parties withstanding is necessary if settlement is to be reached. It's not enough for the party with reparative duties to put forward a proposal that they or some other third party deem to be fair or reasonable. It's up to those who have been wrongfully harmed and who will end up with less than they should to determine what they are prepared to accept. Now, I don't want to underplay the difficulty which this account raises. The vision of good faith settlement that I've advocated is one whereby parties with extensive reparative duties that they can't fulfill are dependent on the goodwill of those to whom the debt is owed. Good faith settlement requires a commitment to a process without knowledge of an outcome. I know of no significant real-world settlement process that obviously realizes such an ideal, though it's not my place to arbitrate on such matters, but that of the victims in question. It's obviously hard to see agents, such as the governments of Western states, being willing to sign up to such a process, and perhaps also hard to imagine how it could result in the kind of broad-based agreement which I've argued is necessary if good faith settlement is to be realized. This is tragic. There is therefore a further inherently political question. If settling up is not available, how should a reparative politics of settling for be organised? What kind of genuine reconciliation, of restoration of the moral equilibrium, is possible or even desirable when some of the parties to the process are not willing to act as moral agents? How should the victims of injustice, wronged once by the initial injustice, wronged again by its ongoing non-rectification, and now wronged yet again by being presented with a morally inadequate offer of bad faith settlement, respond? Such questions are beyond the scope of this talk. But it's clear, I think, that the outcome of such a process, even if it has the practical effect of making things better than they are now, will not be just. Thank you.